Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our very last HAMAA Reads for Black History Month of 2025. Um, I am your host, Samuel Godwin, Vice President of HAMAA, Historical African Martial Arts Association. Here I have today is our President, Mansa Adamiri, and Kari Evans, who is also our Chief Historian of the Historical African Martial Arts Association. So, if you hadn't gotten it, the last three times we've been on here, HAMAA Reads is a time where we get a chance to sit on our armchairs and read and discuss about historical African accounts that that pretty much that come from the source, that come from Africans. To this week, we're going to be focusing on a passage from, and I'm hoping I'm not butchering this, but the title of this is called "The Virtues of Black Abyssinians," and the author of this book is Al-Alama Abu Lafajar Im Al-Jawazi. I hope I didn't butcher that. So, Adam, would you be able to provide us some context?
Sure.
Of this literature?
So to shorten his name, popularly he's called Al-Jahiz. So Al-Jahiz was an Afro-Arab polymath. He studied at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the 10th century. He's noted for writing a lot of works on sociology, religion, politics. He actually was one of the first people to write about the theory of evolution. In his book, I believe it's the Treatise of the Animals or the Treatise of the Birds, one of the two. It's a 7-volume text where he writes down his observations about the changes of animals between their generations. He also was one of the first people to write out a sort of theory for why people have different skin colors that closely resembles the science we have behind the difference in skin color today. His book, The Virtues of the Blacks and the Abyssinians, in many ways is him writing about his experience as an Afro-Arab. And also it's about his pushing back on the concept of racism as it was expressed in the 10th century. Because at that time, Basra, where he was born, was a hub of Afro-Arab community. It actually was the stronghold of the Zanj rebellion. And it was the heart of sort of the Black Iraqi experience. So writing from this place of his observations and hearing comments from other people who would have been in the House of Wisdom, who may not necessarily have shared his views on people being equals. This was one of his texts that, in my view at least, was written in a bit of protest against those ideas.
I see. It adds a little bit more context to the story because, I think that it goes without saying that a lot of it with a lot of people from Islam, idea around race and ethnicity is not necessarily like the most important aspect of one's identity. Most of it is like usually it's about piety and how you worship Allah.
Right.
And it's funny because in the chapter that we're going to be talking about today is going to be really focusing on that specifically. And so like it kind of adds a lot more perspective when it's coming from not only just like any old Muslim, but an African Muslim. So as always, the rules are simple. Like we just, everybody has the comment section open for them. Feel free to provide any like questions that you may have or any comments that you want to have, but make sure that it's respectful. But other than that, just have us in your background, grab a snack, and enjoy the show. So I will be reading chapter 7 of this book, and afterwards we're gonna discuss. So the name of this chapter, the title of this chapter is called "And Proclamation that the White Person has no superiority over the Black, and that superiority lies in piety." So already we're coming at the jugular with this one. So this one, so let's go ahead. Let's just begin. So And please forgive me for any Muslims that are out there who are watching this. Please forgive me for the butchering of some of these names, because they name drop a lot of these things, and I'm not good with Arabic. I'm not good with pronunciation, but I try at least. So first things first, Muhammad ibn Ka'b reported upon the authority of Ibn Abbas that the Messenger of Allah said he who would be happy by being the most honorable of people should have taqwa, taqwa, God consciousness of Allah. Sa'id al-Makburi reported on the authority of Abu Huraira, a man came to the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of Allah, who is the most honorable amongst men?" He replied, "The one with the most taqwa of Allah." One of the ulama scholars said to a noble, "Your nobility is in need of piety, but the one with piety is not in need of nobility." It is reported in the two Sahihs on the authority of Abu Huraira that the Prophet said, "There are two rewards for the righteous slave." There is another hadith reported only by al-Bukhari on the authority of Abu Musa that the Prophet said, "The reward is doubled for the slave who performs his ibadah or worship to Allah well, and also carries out his duties to his master well by being dutiful, sincere, and obedient." And that is the end of the chapter. So, Mansa, what are your takeaways from this chapter?
So my takeaways from this chapter are that he is emphasizing some of the early teachings of Islam, right? And one of those being that there is no, before God at least, there is no other identity than that of a person who follows. So we're talking about the idea that if you are a pious Muslim, if you follow the 5 pillars, if you are kind and generous and you act in ways that are responsible and you stay on top of your prayers and you give God the glory, then these are the things that will identify you as a person of virtue over another person. So your skin color or the thing that you don't control doesn't determine your value. But the thing that you do control, which is your behavior, which is your action, which is the way you represent your faith, that is the thing that matters.
So it's just all about just focusing on your duty as a Muslim, and that's what matters the most. And the way you follow your duty or your taqwa is the most important attribute to the individual person.
Exactly.
Kari, what do you think?
Yeah, basically the same takeaway. He's putting piety as the most important thing. So he's like everything is based off of your piety. He's like other elements should not correspond to how someone is valued.
It almost sounds like it's like a colorblind thing. Like we don't see color,
Yeah.
We only see Muslims and Muslims who worship Allah.
Well, and I think that was supposed to be the point, right? I think the point of the Abrahamic faiths after you look at the foundings of Christianity and the early foundings of Islam was the idea that the early Abrahamic faiths were very, Judaism, Samaritanism, and the other groups were very tribalistic, right? It was our people are chosen, our people are the people who are preeminent, and our God is the most powerful God, and if you're not part of our team, then you're out. But Islam and Christianity and other versions of those later on tended to focus less on membership as a question of bloodline and as a question of phenotype, and more of a question of participation in the religion itself. Because how can your deity be the ultimate deity if that deity is not worshipped by all people?
Exactly. Yeah.
And how can you invite other people to join your non-tribal religion if you don't put value on the essence of the person as opposed to their physical appearance or their ethnic origin. And I think that's something that he hammers home really hard, especially when he is talking about the virtues of, the Blacks and the Abyssinians, etc.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because I was also looking up on like chapters that precede this, and it preceded this chapter, and he does like dive into more details about like the virtues of the Black person and everything else. But it's like, it's for him, it's not really just colorblind. He's not looking at this in the colorblind sense. He's not looking at this as, he's actually looking at this as like, everybody does come from somebody. Everybody has like their lineage. As a matter of fact, he does point out to the fact that a lot of the peoples from in the known world came from like three main patriarchs: Sam, Ham, and what was the other one? Can't remember the other one. It was Sam, Ham, and somebody else. It was the third one. Yeah, but essentially it's like, we all
Shemite.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like we all come from those three patriarchs, and those three patriarchs had their descendants had spread across the known world and created like the many bodies that are relevant to the Muslim people. And recognizing the descendants of Ham, which is supposed to be the patriarch of the Black people that are in the southern parts of Africa and the westerly winds, as he says, it's like, right, to recognize their identity, but at the same time, it's like also to know and understand that like we're still all one people. We're still, under Allah, we're all Muslims if we accept.
Right.
And I'll say too, like for me, looking at the document, it's like what's written, and then there's what's not written in the document.
Mm.
Because, he talks about Black as a concept, and he talks about like Black soil being fertile soil. He talks about how there are men that prefer Black women for their beauty of the the skin and things in the women. He talks about Black seed oil, which is a medicine, and how the seeds are ground down and used to extract the oil, and that it's a cure all for things. And all of it is based off of color, because when we talk about race, right, and the concept of race, there's kind of there are two different ideas that are fused together. So you have white versus Black, and then you have like phenotype. And right. So Blackness can mean like evil, there's a definition of Blackness like darkness. And then you can use Black as in a physical attribute, or you see sometimes they'll say like, the people from the Sudan, they have the burnt skin or they have the dark skin. And so sometimes those go to, especially when you early race, those concepts go together where they try to attribute the phenotype with the nature of the person. And the same way, because it's two different concepts, you also have things where like they'll talk about white Malians, because Mali was an Islamic empire, and they refer to the Malians as white because they are devout practitioners of the faith. And they make a distinction between the white Malians and the Black tribes, which has nothing to do with appearance. It has to do with how the fact that these are people who are pagans, these are people who are non-believers. And those ideas get mashed together all the time. So here he's kind of addressing both of them in the same. So like he's saying, first of all, Black is not negative inherently, right? He also talks about whiteness, how whiteness can be, negative too. So he's saying, like, first of all, just like based off of the colors, just like if you were going to do like, if anyone's played Dark Souls, right? The first Dark Souls, it goes light and dark, heat and cold. There is this thing of opposites where it's like when early philosophy, they're always finding the opposites of things, right? To kind of understand the world. Even if you go to like the something when they talk about the different elements of the world, and they're like, there's wood and fire and wind. It's this idea of like there's these different forces that are diametrically opposed to one another. So he's addressing both that. He's addressing black as being seen as like a mark of evil. He's also addressing how these people physically look, because in the first chapter he says that the Ethiopians that were in this land, right, that they were complimenting their looks compared to looks of people around them, which is his reason for writing this, right? If that really what happened, because like again, I said this, to me, this document is more so speaking about probably the political situation from his era, and then further on,
Right.
as you go into the Islamic world.
And I think it's also really important too to note that the conception of race in the Middle East in the 10th century is very different from the conception of race in 2025 in the Western world.
Yeah.
And so even what we would consider to be black or a black person may not even fit their description of what a black person is in the 10th century, right? Mm-hmm. I find in our time and in the place that we live, we have a much broader definition of what a black person is, versus in their time, you quite literally had to look like a black in color or very, very dark person to be considered black, because you could be a person from any nation along that corridor and be a black person. It didn't necessarily mean that you came from one specific place, that you either came from Ethiopia or you came from the Sudan, right? Because where he lived, Basra had a lot of black Arabs living in it. A lot of black people lived in the south of Saudi Arabia. In fact, one of the greatest heroes of pre-Islamic Arabia is well, we would call him black. They called him black as well. And he was born in Najd, Saudi Arabia. So it's definitely a question of looking into that view. But I also think that this is colored by the fact that the Arab slave trade at that time was quite active, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking a 1700-year-old institution that, even though it was not necessarily race-based, because it was based on people who didn't share the same religion or war captives or what have you, that we can't deny the massive number of Africans that were absorbed by this trade. I think it was something in the field of 17 million people from Africa in that period of time.
Yeah.
So it would be a mistake on our part to imagine that there wouldn't be some sort of racial element to people who live in a place where black people are not very common, who often only encounter black people as slaves or slave soldiers or concubines or bodyguards, right?
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the next question I have, because that is the thing. So like a lot of this is like it's like a faith-based conceptual thing, where you know and recognize that as long as you believe in Allah, that you are, like you are us, you are one of us. And that brings us to the point of like, how was this implemented culturally? Because it doesn't seem as though that it was necessarily implemented culturally. And it even seems as though now understanding the context, that this piece, this prose, serves as almost like a protest, like a sense of bringing awareness to the very nature of this Islamic culture, especially around that time. And it makes you wonder, how was it implemented? And bringing up the slave trade, it's like, we're starting to see a little bit of contradictions in there. Right. But I'm gonna let you guys explain that one.
Well, I'll say we're in an era where like race and relations is different from this in the modern world, but some of those ideas stem from this time. Some of these things are starting to develop. And so, especially if you talk about just Islam as a religion, it's a literate religion. Remember, the Bible for the longest time was read to the masses. The whole Protestant Reformation, all that kind of stuff was the idea that a normal person could even read the text without being part of the priesthood. So, but then you have Islam where they encourage people to be literate, to be able to read read all the literature, to understand it for themselves, to discuss it, scholarship, things like that. So that's kind of like, when you look at Islam, you kind of have to see it as like a early, even that kind of being like a modern thing, the ability to have people from all over the world reading the same documents, coming to consensus, having scholars from one different group going and traveling somewhere else. And then the other thing is, you have to say power dynamics. So like I said, the white Malians, right? If one of the things that they say is like, one Muslim Islamic nation shouldn't attack another one because they're all united in faith, right? It's the same thing that you have with the Christian kingdoms whenever they go on crusade, right? It's the idea that they are all under God's kingdom, right? But, you look at history and it's not really that cut and dry. I mean, the Byzantines were sacked by their allies a couple of times for not paying their dues. And in the same way, when you have Mali going to decline, what was the battle that knocked them off? Who were they fighting? Oh, they were fighting, North African kingdoms, the shooters and stuff that came down. Another Islamic state, came and attacked them. And then you have jihads, like you talk about 18th, 19th century, you have all the Fulani jihadists, where they're also they're attacking people who practice traditional African religions and things, but they're also attacking people who are just they have a different interpretation of it. And the idea is like a reformation of that. They want to adhere to a more fundamentalist, or like a more bare bone version of what another group who might incorporate some of their traditional aspects, like Mali did. Mali incorporated, Islam never replaced the traditions they had that predated the conversion. Even to become king of Mali, there were rituals that you had to do that had nothing to do with Islam. And it was actually kind of a point of contention where they would say that, Mali in some ways was the most devout and other ways wasn't, because there's this cultural difference. In the same way, if you go over into the Near East, there are cultural differences that change the way that it is practiced, depending on what caliphate you're in or whatever. And I'll say one last thing, and I'll let you speak. But then the other thing is, early capitalistic or mercantile systems. If you have a product and the product is slaves, and the area that you can raid for slaves, you can't necessarily easily attack your northern neighbors like that. They did to an extent. You had like the pirates and things like that. But if you look just from geography, right, it is easier to go down south and attack, the weaker kingdoms and peoples and things like that. And also you had already established slave markets, like you go in East Africa with, Zanzibar and things like that. And then you also have the Saharan slave trade. And so if you need to justify your ability to tap into that market, also like militarily, you have hundreds of thousands of African slave soldiers. And like, you need a justification of why you're allowed to do that. So there's a lot of different things mashed up, which is why I think this document is interesting, because it presents almost like a legalistic argument.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought, and just a side note, as like a scholar, as somebody who like looks at like, well, I actually was kind of like forced to look at articles for my projects, but like seeing humans, especially how they cite how he cited his sources. A lot of it was just like, oh, such and such said this, such and such said the same thing. Such and such said the same thing, but with a different version. It's like a constant repeat just to reiterate the point that is being made within this essay, within this persuasive essay. So, and, as you mentioned, the slave soldiers, it's funny because it's like, we think about the Mamluks. Every time we think of Islam and we think of slave soldiers, we are automatically thinking about the Mamluks, because that was like a very like successful system, you know, right up there with like the Janissaries. And yet the representation of how it shows up in on the historical record doesn't show a lot of what we would consider in the modern context. You know, you don't see a lot of Black soldiers. Even when you get into conversations about like the overall identity of like the Mamluk soldiers, a lot of people will say, and rightfully so, they will say that a lot of these slaves come from the Turkish, the Kipchak Turkish, the boys from the Caucasus Mountains, like those, and they're like really represented as like the face of the Mamluks, but you do not see a single like Black African soldier. It almost seems as though like you have to postulate that.
Well,
like,
it's you know, when you're talking about the Mamluks specifically, even though there was variety, one of the things was they were getting the people from the mountains and things like that, because there was this idea of like you take a certain cultural group and you use them as fighters. But the thing is, the Mamluks is just one group of slave soldiers out of all of the majority of the slave soldiers came from West Africa and other kingdoms going down south, and you know, the Sudan, things like that. And so like when you go into Morocco, you know, they used vast, you know, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were coming from, you know, basically like Mauritania and, you know, further south down.
Yeah.
I think that because we're in like with modern white supremacy and things like that, there is an idea of kind of, even if you're saying these are enslaved soldiers, like these aren't necessarily the people ruling, but even like if you go back to the Kingdom of Morocco, there's two sides of slavery, or you know, we have, you know, the soldiers, but we also have the concubines.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when you go into ethnicity, a lot, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I'm Black American. One of the things here is that one of the reasons why the United States is patrilineal is because when slave owners would father children, you know, there's this question of like, well, what group does the child belong to, you know? And so if it was a matrilineal system versus if patrilineal versus matrilineal. So it was patrilineal, like Europe was very patrilineal, right?
Mm.
But it kind of flipped because it was this idea of that you don't want to have to claim this children. When you go to like Haiti and things like that, you have like the free colors and things where they kept that system. But in the United States, they actually switched it so that they could basically not have to claim their kids, like, you know, in the same way you have, I guess you would consider Black Arab rulers of Morocco whose mothers are concubines that come from the south, but they associate purely amongst their father's lineage, even though their mothers probably look like us, like, you know, but it's like there's this rejection of that part of them.
And I think that's really important to bring up as well, right? Because the tradition of Black bodyguards and Black soldiers is so endemic to the medieval Islamic world. Even recently, shortly after it, in the 1600s, Prince Ismail had something like 100,000 Black soldiers at his beck and call through the Black Guard. And the Black Guard exists today as an institution in the Palace of Morocco. The King of Morocco's bodyguards, the Royal Guard of Morocco, I think they're called now, still has a mostly Black presence in the units, even though now it's more mixed. You know, they're not slave soldiers anymore. They haven't been for generations, but that institution still exists and is often populated by Black Moroccans. And even the idea that, you're right, that many of these women who ended up becoming concubines to these various sultans, nobles, tribal chieftains, different leaders, when they had their children became associated with their father's lineage. It's why, for example, when you have people like Antara bin Shaddad, we know who his father is. We know very little about his mother. His mother is a footnote because of the patriarchal nature of the culture that he came up in. This isn't meant to disrespect his mother and say that she wasn't valuable, and this isn't meant to disrespect the culture, saying that the culture was not valuable, but more to understand the psychology of that. And so I think that's also kind of important in the way that Al-Jahiz owns his blackness in the text, and how he owns the contributions of not just Black Arabs or Arabized Africans, but Black people in general to the sphere of influence in the world that he inhabits. Because if you think about it, he's only a couple of generations removed from the Umayyad Caliphate, which was the entire furthest extent of a unified Muslim world. And he very much was still living in the shadow of that, when all of these different peoples suddenly started speaking Arabic, or suddenly started adopting this new religion, or suddenly started fighting in the armies and building the schools and being involved in every aspect of that, of the cultural, social, political, and economic life. And so I think very much he's thinking about people who may have in living memory dealt with people who grew up during the Umayyad Caliphate. If you think about it, I think about the example of my great-grandparents. Both of my great-grandparents, who I've met, who I have color photos of, who I have pictures with, they were both born in the late 19th century. Right? Mm-hmm. They were children when Queen Victoria was still ruling the British Empire. Mm. And that's not that far back. So if you think about it, you know, I would still, that distance of time to him in the year 900, what have you, in the early 900s.
No, I think, was it
the late 900s?
Oh, it was 1200. I think
no, he was 1200s. Are you sure he wasn't 10th century?
Let me look at it again.
Or was it 1258?
Let me look at it again.
I think it was the 12. It was like 11.
Okay, well, if it's the 12th century, then I'm completely wrong.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, if it's the 12th century, I'm completely wrong then. He's a couple of hundred years out of that. I was off by a couple hundred years, so ignore everything I just said. But yeah, still. Also coming off of even just the example of tying it back to, for example, the wars that the Rashidun Caliphate had in the 7th century with the Christian kingdoms of Makuria, Nobatia, etc. Right? The idea that there was this constant inflow of Black people from that region of Africa into the Arab world as a result of a treaty that lasted until what, the 1300s or something like that, or longer than that. It was like it was a 1300-year-old treaty. It was stupidly long. You know the one I'm talking about, right, Kari?
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's just really important to consider as well, that there is just all of this context in the world that he lived in around race relations between different nations that may not have been part of the same community and now suddenly are.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to say like we're using modern terms because it's like I would say like even it's like ethnicity and race, because like the idea of race is like a modern concept.
Yeah.
Now that's not to say people don't see the difference, but the idea of like having a universal kinship between different groups based off of phenotype is what I mean specifically. Because you can have two groups, like especially, you know, you look at conflicts, especially like if you go into like at a tribe level, right? Where like ethnically they might be genetically so similar that you might not even be able to tell the difference, but there's a cultural divide. You know, the idea that you are both, even though like you know that you're different, you're both kin based off of genetics, right?
Yeah,
is a modern concept. But one thing I will say about kind of like when I want to say like slave soldiers, why was that even implemented? What was the advantage of having that? And the idea is that you have these people that are from somewhere else and you transplant them into a new land. And so they don't have any ties. One of the things with slavery is it's an artificial way of basically creating a state of helplessness. So they're soldiers, right? They have weapons. How are they helpless? Well, it's like, okay, if they were to try to rebel or if they were trying to go away or more so, they're just not tied into anything. So like they're looking to you if you're like the head of the family, right? And you're bringing them in, you know, if you're giving them their pay, you're giving them land, usually slave soldiers are treated a little bit better than, you know, someone working in a mine, like, you know,
they're
going to look to you and they're going to be more likely to support you in times of conflict than someone who might have ties to that land, might have their own title, might have their own people to go back to. And so it's this idea of like, I can create this loyal force. I can import loyal soldiers that won't turn against me because I am basically their lifeline. Because they're in this hostile world. Like, they're in this hostile area because we've transplanted them from where they're at. And so that was kind of how a lot of these kingdoms kept control, is that you make them do the stuff that people don't even like them. Like, a lot of times it's like they're the ones that collect taxes. They're the ones that, execute people or do the like nasty work of empire, because there's an idea of like, you separate them from the rest of the community, and then they not only are they looking to you for food and money and shelter, there's also like they have no oneness with the actual people. But and so you can use them to great effect to basically secure your rule. And one thing I would say is the legacy of that is that when the Spanish Civil War happened, right, and you had the I think of fascists or whatever, like the leaders. It was like one group that was fighting on like the side of the Allies, or who would become the Allies later. This is one of those conflicts that happened right before the big conflict popped off. And you see it all around where they say like, how did people not know that World War II was going to pop off or whatever? It's like, well, you can look and you can see all these but you can see all these different regional conflicts that were based off of that bigger geopolitical bomb that was about to go off, right? Just like how they'll say the failure of the League of Nations, part of that was their failure to protect Ethiopia. That was really why a lot of people pulled out of the League of Nations, was because but that's a tangent. Anyway, one of the things that, like, basically, I guess the one that was against, the Western allies, right? One of the things he did in order to basically scare people into not wanting to fight him was that he said he was going to use black soldiers, because Spain has this history of black soldiers being like, I think of Dune, I think of like Sardaukar, like the Death Commandos, right? So he said, and funny enough, both sides had black soldiers, because you had American forces, you had American Expeditionary Force in Spain that had a unit of black soldiers. So both sides had black soldiers fighting, but it was this cultural memory in Spaniards of black soldiers being kind of crazy. And so that's those caliphate slave armies. So even though you don't see them, I remember there was a show about El Cid, who is a national hero for Spain.
Oh yeah, the Spanish one on that one network, right?
Yeah. So,
oh man, I was obsessed with that show.
Well, one thing they did, and I told Sam this, and I really liked that show because I compared it. It was two shows. It was Nightfall, and it was El Cid. I was watching them at the same time. I was comparing them to historical night drama things, right? Well, one of the things was that they took the vast legions of black slave soldiers and condensed it into one character who in battle surfs on a horse and like basically kick flips a spear in the enemy camp. But it's supposed to be the representation of all of the, basically black African soldiers that would have been in that conflict. But instead of hiring a bunch of extras, they just have this one guy who's supposed to represent multitudes of soldiers. But
and he was like the deadliest dude in the show.
Yeah, he's like a ninja.
The deadliest.
I gotta check this out. I haven't seen that yet. I've only seen
one thing I didn't like though is that the armor they gave him was a couple of centuries too late, and it was too big for the actor. Like, it was just hanging off of him. They couldn't have just given him chainmail. They had to give him the Krug armor to make him look exotic. But like the Krug armor was not really a Moorish thing. So yikes. But still, he was dangerous, man. He was so dangerous. When he got on that horse and he started riding into that battle, like a laser drone focused on getting the enemy king, I'm like, There's a reason why they didn't send him out first.
He was just sitting. He was like sent. Like it was like the battle was like joined, and they were just like finish it. And he just like shot forward and just it was ridiculous. But you know, it's funny. But they're showing like even in Spain, you know, when they ride, they have two styles of riding. Like you know,
yeah,
you basically do it a European way, and they do it like an African way.
Well, there's another interesting, really film I want you to check out. It's called The Physician, and it's the same thing. The Sultan of the House of Wisdom, or the Sultan of, I think it was Baghdad, the guy who was in charge of the city, he had a contingent of African bodyguards that followed him everywhere. And the actors that got to play these bodyguards were huge. Like these guys were, I don't know where they found these dudes, but they were massive. And this goes into the idea of the when we talk about the slave soldiers, and I think when we think about slavery in our context, we think about being shabbily dressed and underfed. But if you're a soldier of the Sultan, then you have to look good, you have to look healthy, you have to be well dressed, you have to be well armed, because you represent the glory of the Sultan.
Right. It's like the because like even just looking at just going back to the Mamluks again, like they're damn near the whoever the sovereign is who's overseeing this whole operation. They're his sons. Like the way they get the best training, they get like the best Islamic what's it called, best Islamic training. And this is not to be an apologist for slavery, but it's just like they're given a differential type of treatment where they're essentially are like, you know what, you're going to be my best fighter, and I will need you, so I need to make sure that you are given the best tools in order to become successful as my bodyguard, or as my elite soldiers, as my knights, for lack of better terms.
Right.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. So like that's kind of what I was talking about that displacing people thing, right? Like, so it's slavery. It's an artificial bond. Like, you know, it's an unearned bond to give to these people. But also it's like if you were a parent and you could buy a student, like, you know, like
that is woo.
Like, you know, you could buy it, like, you know, you're taking this person like that. That's basically what it is. Like the way that they see it is because, so I'll go away from I'll go into Mali. I read a book. It was a chapter. The book was about, it was called African Domination. It was about all the different African empires. And so there's talked about Mali, and there was a chapter on, I think it was either that or it was like history of Mali. But anyway, there was a chapter on unfreedom, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't called slavery. It was about unfreedom. And so the author, he talked about how there was this relationship between a regional king, because Mali's an empire. So there's different kingdoms within Mali, right? So there's the king of this one group in Mali, and he basically has a slave who owns a plantation that, I don't know, they were growing figs or something. I don't know what they were growing. Some kind of grain, or, you know, big farm operation. Like they said plantation. So this is like acres and acres of stuff, right? And so he had this thing where he would give a certain amount of tribute to the king annually. And that was the price of his like enslavement. That was like what he owed him for enslavement. There was a discrepancy where essentially there was a very good harvest. And so the king of the region demanded a higher percentage of his goods, right? And then the person refused. And so there was this argument that kind of was put where the king wrote this letter, and he basically said, you know, you're my slave, you know, and so all of your glories are my glories, you know? And so he says, like, he basically like, how dare you not give me more of your good harvest is my good harvest because I own you, essentially, right? On the flip side, it's not like, you know, if you don't pay your mortgage, the bank forecloses on your home. On the flip side, he didn't go and just send his guards to like take his stuff, because he recognized in the letter that the plantation and all the fields belong to the slave.
Mm.
So that's why they're talking about this idea of like unfreedom, where it's like, your good harvest you need to give me. At the same time, I'm not going to take the plantation from you because that is your property. And so you get this very complex web of relationships. Another thing is, like, if you go into Mali, you have the the sofa, right? And they're primarily there's different interpretations, but they're either archers or they're guardians of the horse. So they're the people who take care of the horses. Later on, they become mounted soldiers. The higher level ones are mounted soldiers. So you have the lowly slave soldiers who are archers, and then the higher ones are basically like companion riders, essentially, right? And one of the things with the sofa is that they had this ritual they would do. And part of the ritual was that it barred them from serving as rulers. And so, and it wasn't based in Islam. It was based off of traditional beliefs in that region. But it was this idea that there needs to be a separation because some of these enslaved people, I mean, Mansa Musa was a slave originally. You know, he had a servant, he had an unfreedom to the king that went and sailed off, you know. He had a subservient relationship to him. So, and then, you know, there's arguments like even like how he came into power with that, you know, how did he not get barred, but he was the one put in charge. So like it gets very complicated, if you can imagine, where you have these people who are like bound, but at the same time, they might be the governor. Like, you know, it's not like, you know, like American chattel slavery, where there's this idea that all like for chattel slavery, all white people are above all the black enslaved people, right? You could have an enslaved person in the Islamic world that you have to show deference to, you know?
Yep.
They might be, you know, the regent, or they might be the general, or they might be, you know, and so it's really that bond between the person who holds the ownership and the person who is enslaved. And you find so many different variations of that, where you have one where you have very exploitative, and then you have very, I wouldn't say beneficial, but at less invasive versions of that all throughout, which makes it also, you know, kind of complicated. And then Islam talks about treatment of the slave. It's not, but there is, you know, complications with it. And again, it goes into it being like a kind of a modern thing, where you start having these kind of complex relationships discussed and written about in a way that it can be analyzed, instead of it being like de facto, you know?
Absolutely. And I mean, just sliding back into Al-Jahiz's work, he definitely addresses this. In fact, in chapter 8, which I don't think we'll have time to get into, but in chapter 8, he discusses the virtues of a black king in Abyssinia, when he talks about the Prophet Muhammad and the first Ummah of Islam going to live in Abyssinia and hiding from persecution, and how the king didn't persecute his people. There was like I think the way he was described is that he was a king that did not oppress his people, and that's why the early Muslims went to live under his protection. And very much the way that he describes the justness, the wisdom, the humanity of this ruler. And I mean, let's be honest, in the medieval era, you know, we're not exactly looking at the most humane political systems, right? But the fact that in a world where everybody is a serf, basically, living under a king that is identified as one who does not oppress his people, makes you wonder what his way of treating his people was. Was he lenient on taxes? Was he not sending soldiers to crack people's heads open all the time? Was he welcoming of new people moving into his kingdom and seeking his protection? Sort of what kind of king was he? But then even just talking about the way he would listen to people and the way he would analyze information given to him, and that going back into chapter 7, where Al-Jahiz talks about piety being the marker of a person's value. Because here he is describing a person of another religion, right? He's talking about a person of another religion who would ostensibly be, I think in his time, an infidel was somebody who wasn't Ahi al-Kitab or a person of the book, but it extended later on towards anybody who doesn't follow Islam as opposed to people who just didn't follow the religion of Abraham. But essentially, this was a man who was part of a religion that the Islamic world had made war on for centuries through its expansion and its enslavement of Christians from Europe and Africa and other places. And he is ascribing such high value and high respect to this person because of the virtues that he has inherently. And he uses that as an example, among other things that he writes in his book, of the virtues of the blacks and the Abyssinians in his time. And I mean, it's just so interesting to see somebody from so long ago write about the essence of black identity when it may have had a completely different meaning from us today.
Exactly. And even just like, when you think about it, like, everybody says like race is like a modern concept, and for real, it is a modern concept. White supremacy itself was like a modern concept, but I think the overall spirit of like the spirit of I am better than this other group of people has something that is something that's persisted throughout time, and it always seems to happen with people of lighter hue versus people of a little darker hue, a darker complexion. Because even that same thing, when we go as far back as like the Roman Empire during Julius Caesar's time, when he's looking at when people of Rome looked at other nations and cultures, of course it comes at a national there's a national identity with that, but again that national identity is revolving around ethnicity. It is revolving around the psychology behind, you know, my ethnic group is the more powerful group because for my ethnic group, I had, we have had sent men out to conquer these lands, and these nations and other stuff work for us. Because eventually, you know, as the auxiliary body starts to grow within the Roman Empire, you look at it as more like a, again, I am the pure Roman. I am the Roman that matters. Right. Top cream of the crop. And it's funny about that, as I bring up the Roman and not realizing that it's such a good idea, you still had that social mobility for people who were on the outside. I'm not going to name drop the guy because I can't remember his name fully, but you do have black legatus. I think I got the title right. I think it's
legatus.
Yeah,
but and that's the idea, right? I mean, even in the Roman Empire, it was more a question of cultural chauvinism at a certain point beyond just an ethnic chauvinism, because you had 3 or 4 African emperors in Rome's history. You had Arab emperors, you had Greek emperors, you had Germanic emperors, you had them expanding on it. And the thing for the Romans, you know, if we're going in that place, it's if you spoke Latin, if you followed the Roman gods, if you obeyed Roman customs, you were a Roman after a certain point, right? You could argue that Romans who officially came from Latinum may have enjoyed a particular level of social power, but I think also, if I remember correctly, later on it eventually just became a question of money, right? If you were rich, you spoke Latin, had a Roman name, maybe had a cousin or two among the patrician class, you were doing all right. But even then, Roman racism wasn't necessarily just directed against African people. I mean, if you read about what the Romans wrote about their first experience encountering the early peoples of Britain, they don't have very nice things to say about them.
Of course not. Yeah.
Right? Like they're outright mean. And the same way they talked about other Celts, the way they talked about Germanic peoples, the way they talked about the peoples living in Dacia. I mean, Romans were equal opportunity racists. But even so, you know, we're talking about a world that just, the conceptions of these things are just so different from what we have now.
Yeah, it's like, and like I say, like when you go and like when you talk about modern, right? One of the things is like the ability to like for example, you say they can, you know, do this and do that, then they're Roman, right? Well, you kind of had that. You go early America, one of the like things that people look at was there was this case where you had an enslaved African and two indentured white people run away from their plantation, right? And they were captured, and essentially, while the two white guys were given like an extra couple of years, the black person, the African person, was told that they would remain a slave for the rest of their life. And kind of when you have early America, there's this idea that basically there's an argument whether or not that Africans are bound by race or bound by law. Because there was even an argument that said that they weren't bound by English laws because they had no treaties with them. And so essentially over time, what happens is it becomes a more race-based thing, you know? You have different systems. You go down to the Caribbean and stuff, they're doing the blood quantum thing, right? Where they're saying, well, how much of one race you're doing. And, you know, you can look up scientific racism and, you know, that has a long history. But, you know, essentially people had to create the metrics because before it was like, we don't like this specific group. We don't like this kingdom, right? Or, you know, it's like, oh, you're a Protestant, I'm a Catholic. You know, we're from the same city though. Like, you know, so it's like this idea, these broad, when people start thinking globally, you're basically in the modern world. When people are understand, like, you know, like when you know, the Chinese emperor receives people from different places, right? Their context is we are the center of the world, and my subjects that are from so far away that I can't be bothered to see them are sending me gifts, right? That's that's not true. Like, you know, that's the lie. That's the line. It's like, oh yeah, you know, China goes on forever. So it's like, you know, these are just really, really distant provinces that are just,
all under heaven.
Yeah,
right, exactly. The domain of heaven.
Well, that's just the interesting part about the way that different people see the world, right? You know, you could travel to you know, places in, even if you look at India in the 15 and 1600s, right? You had whole contingents of Africans that would have been trained as mercenaries. I was reading about the life of Malik Ambar, who was a kingmaker in the Deccan province of southern India. And he himself had an entire unit of Ethiopians that was part of his army that he used to support the king of Deccan against the Marathas and the Mughals and anybody else who basically wanted to come and take their land. And you know, that's sort of the interesting part, right? When we're taking a look at people in those times, looking at and examining the question of their identity, of who they are, and what that identity means in the context of the world that they live
in. So, any closing remarks, fellas? Because we're like 2 minutes left.
I just say, like, you know, it's interesting whenever you're looking at a document as time progresses, because you can kind of see the receipts of things, right? You can kind of start making conjectures. You lose like, you know, you're not there with him in the courts when he's writing this, but like you also have hundreds and hundreds of years before and after to look at to kind of contextualize things. And, you know, that's always interesting when looking at documents like this.
Yeah. I would say, and this is for anybody who's watching right now, I hope that what you've taken from the HAMAA Read series is that Africans historically have documented their experiences in writing, that if you are willing to take the time to go out and look, you will find people writing in every century about their experiences, the world that they lived in, the things that they observed, and giving us a new perspective on events that we either may not have access to, or things that we may not have had, or things that we may not have a full perspective of, simply because they were not written about, or they were written about by people who have decided what the narrative is. So, you know, you may end up getting a European perspective on this Africans on an interaction with these Africans. But what did the Africans actually say about their interactions from their perspective in those times?
And I second that one. And I don't have much else to say. But all in all, on behalf of HAMAA, we thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for taking the time to really get a chance to, you know, sit with us, listen, talk, share your words of encouragement with us as we were going through these different African accounts of history. We hope to do this again next year, and we hope to see you guys next year. Thank you guys for coming, and I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you, fellas, for coming in and having this discussion with us. And have a good night, everybody.